In the 2025 NFL season, the NFC West boasted 3 teams with 12 or more wins, including the number 1 seed in the conference, who eventually went on to be the Super Bowl champ. Even with the 3-14 Cardinals in the division, the NFC West had the best average win percentage and the best average point differential in the NFL at plus 74, with the second best coming from the NFC North at plus 34, 40 points lower. This was one of the most competitive and well-rounded divisions in recent memory, hosting one of the strongest teams on both sides of the ball in NFL history. But here's the thing. This past season wasn't the strongest season for the NFC West. And honestly, it's not even close.
We all we got! We all we need! We all we got! We all we need! We all we got! We all we need! Let's go!
In 2013, the NFC West had the 13-win Seahawks, 12-win 49ers, and 10-win Cardinals. Compared to the 2025 season, the NFC West in 2013 had an average win percentage 5% stronger than 2025 at 65.6%, an average point differential more than 15 points higher than 2025 at plus 89.8, and a net EPA per play that was 29% better than the division's league-leading figure this past season. The 2013 NFC West was one of the strongest divisions in NFL history, with its division leader also being the NFC's number 1 seed and eventual Super Bowl champ. So I wanted to figure out, what was each division's best season? Let's cover when each of the 8 NFL divisions were at their peak, and take a look back at those teams from each division's peak year to tell the story behind the numbers. For this exercise, I started from the 2002 season, as that's when the NFL went through its last realignment and gave us the 4-team, 4 divisions per conference structure that's used today. Since I already mentioned this division at the top, let's start with the NFC West. But before we go back to 2013, I wanted to go through how each division's peak was chosen. Originally, I used a combination of average win percentage and point differential, but I thought that was maybe too simplistic and could be skewed too heavily by dominant teams at the top of a division. Then I tried out a composite score of non-division win percentage and PFR's SRS metric to adjust for strength of schedule while removing any potential noise, with teams facing off against division opponents 6 times a year. But I eventually landed on using net EPA per play with data pulled from NFL FastR, which is a dataset that contains NFL play-by-play data dating all the way back to 1999. By using EPA, we can get a clean look into the quality of each team on both sides of the ball, and therefore, the quality of a division on both sides of the ball. So with all that being said, let's look at the NFC West in 2013. The NFC West in 2013 had 3 top 10 defenses in terms of points allowed, and even the 7-9 Rams had an above average defense that year as well. But the best defense in the division was also the best defense in the league, and was also one of the best defenses in NFL history. We're of course talking about the Legion of Boom. 2013 was the Legion of Boom's best season. They allowed the fewest passing yards and rushing touchdowns in the league, had the most interceptions, and had a defensive EPA that was nearly 60% better than the second strongest team in the NFL. And we all know this defense was stacked. 2 first-team All-Pros in Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, who was a second-team All-Pro, second-year Bobby Wagner, along with Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett in their first seasons with the team. People will debate the 2013 and the 2025 Seattle Seahawks, and even though a metric like DVOA ranks the dark side over the Legion of Boom, I have to side with 2013. It might be nostalgia or whatever, but that defense with that talent on that roster was unreal and put fear into people's hearts. Now, their offense wasn't elite by any means, but it was still the best in the division, led by second-year Russell Wilson and Marshawn Lynch. The Niners had the second best offense in the division, fueled by Colin Kaepernick, Frank Gore, Anquan Boldin, and Vernon Davis. Coming off of a Super Bowl loss to the Ravens, the keys were firmly in the hands of Cap as Alex Smith was traded in the offseason. And even though they didn't win a Lombardi, there seemed to be a little bit of a hangover to start the year. Their offense would have ranked out much better on the season if it weren't for their second and third games, where they only put up 3 and 7 points in those games. But they quickly turned it around, scoring 30 plus points in the next 5. And their defense was no slouch either, with Navarro Bowman and Patrick Willis as linebackers, rookie Eric Reed with 4 picks, and Tremaine Brock with 5, along with Ahmad Brooks and Aldon Smith, both with 8.5 sacks. But the Niners didn't have the second best defense in the division. That belonged to the Arizona Cardinals. Patrick Peterson had a first-team All-Pro season. Rookie Tyrann Mathieu made an impact. Calais Campbell had 9 sacks and 21 QB hits. John Abraham led the team with 11.5 sacks. And linebackers Carlos Dansby and Darrell Washington combined for 6 interceptions. The Cardinals' offense was decent. Carson Palmer had 4,200 yards and 24 touchdowns, but also had 22 interceptions and took 41 sacks. No Cardinals running back hit over 700 yards, and the only 1,000-yard receiver on the team was, of course, Michael Floyd. At the bottom of the division, Mr. 500 himself, of course, led the Rams to a 7-9 record, which was the third time he'd gone 7-9 in his career, but was the fourth time in his career that he had 7 wins. The Rams, who were still in St. Louis at that point, had a tough quarterback year, with Sam Bradford and Kellen Clemens splitting snaps after Bradford tore his ACL in Week 7, while their leading rusher averaged less than 4 yards a carry. But someone who couldn't relate to that was rookie Tavon Austin. He had a game against the Colts where he had 2 catches for 138 yards and 2 touchdowns, plus a 95-yard punt return touchdown. But like I mentioned before, their defense was above average. Robert Quinn in his third year had 19 sacks, led the league in TFLs with 23, forced 7 fumbles, and had 34 QB hits. On the other side of the line, Chris Long chipped in 8.5 sacks, and linebackers Alec Ogletree and James Laurinaitis both had over 115 tackles. The Seahawks were the number 1 seed in the NFC, the Niners were 5th, and the Cardinals just missed out on the second wildcard spot, even though they were still in playoff contention heading into Week 17. Seattle and San Francisco eventually met in the NFC Championship game and gave us an instant classic and one of the most iconic moments in NFL history. The Seahawks defense steamrolled the historically dominant Denver Broncos offense and solidified this season with the Lombardi. In terms of VPA, the 2021 NFC West comes in a close second to 2013. The Rams went on to be Super Bowl champs that season. The Niners lost to the Rams in the NFC Championship at 3 points. The Cardinals started the season 7-0. And the Seahawks still had an above-average offensive season in what was Russ's last year. The 2013 NFC West was not only the strongest division in football during the 2013 season, but a historically strong division ending with the second-best division-wide EPA since 2002. So that leads us to the division that graded out with the strongest season compared to all 8 divisions since 2002. And it's also the division with the most recent peak, with that being the 2024 NFC North. Even with the Chicago Bears team that went 5-12, the 2024 NFC North was the best division in football that year and the strongest divisional performance in either conference since 2002. The Lions went 15-2, the Vikings went 14-3, and the Packers went 11-6. These 3 teams had defenses that were top 6 in the NFL, offenses that were all in the top 15, and were all in the top 10 of the league when combining both sides of the ball. The best team in the division was the Detroit Lions. The Lions' offense in 2024 was elite. Jared Goff had over 4,600 yards with 37 touchdowns with a 72.4 completion percentage. Jahmyr Gibbs had 1,400 yards with 16 touchdowns on 5.6 yards per carry, and both Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams cleared 1,000 yards. And even though the Lions' defense ranked 6th in the league, they were kind of held together by the power of friendship. Only 2 players on the Lions' defense started all 17 games, and only 1 started 16. Their best defender, Aiden Hutchinson, went down early in that season after getting off to a historic start with 7.5 sacks and only 5 games. But it was the Vikings that had the best defense in the division, and the 3rd best in the league. Jonathan Grenard and Andrew Van Ginkel were maniacs on both ends of the defensive line, both clearing 10 sacks. Byron Murphy had a 6-interception season, with 6 other players recording at least 2 picks. And although they allowed the 28th most yards through the air, they made up for it by allowing the 2nd least amount of yards on the ground while leading the league in turnovers. Sam Darnold had a revival this year, throwing for 4,300 yards and 35 touchdowns to only 12 picks. This was also Aaron Jones' first year in Minnesota, and he cleared 1,100 yards on the ground and had over 400 yards through the air. And Justin Jefferson had a monster season with over 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns, being the beneficiary of Darnold's deep ball the entire season. But even though the Vikings had a better record, the Packers actually ended with the 2nd highest net EPA in the division in 2024, with an offense that ranked 8th and a defense that ranked 4th. Green Bay was well-rounded, even with Jordan Love missing 2 games early in the year. They had a good by-committee receiving core, and Josh Jacobs did his thing with 1,300 yards on the ground, 15 touchdowns, and finally had the first receiving touchdown of his career. There weren't many standout players on the Packers defense, with the only exception maybe being Xavier McKinney with his 8 interceptions. But other than McKinney, it was just a good contribution from players all over that side of the ball in the first year of Jeff Hafley's scheme. There were 11 players with 2 or more sacks, 6 players with 80 or more tackles, and guys were available, with 6 players starting all 17 games. And the Bears, well, we know how their season went.
And the ball is caught!
They were bad on both sides of the ball, had some of the most embarrassing moments of this past decade, and fired their head coach mid-season for the first time in franchise history. Each of the NFC North teams lost in their first playoff game, which definitely puts a damper on what was an incredible regular season performance for this division. The NFC North season that was the second strongest in this division's history since 2002 was actually last year, and the 2025-2026 season followed closely by the 2011 season, a season that is carried heavily by the performance of the Packers and the Lions. In 2011, the Packers went 15-1 in an Aaron Rodgers MVP year where he threw for 4,600 yards, 45 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. Their defense was below average this year, so Rodgers was really backpacking this team, as also both of the Packers' leading rushers only combined for just over 1,100 yards. The 2011 Lions had a good, not great offense, as Stafford had over 5,000 passing yards and 41 touchdowns, with Calvin Johnson catching 1,600 of those yards and 16 of those touchdowns. Their defense actually graded out higher than the Packers as they generated a ton of turnovers, third most in the league, and returned 7 of those turnovers for touchdowns. The next division has been struggling as of recent, but during the late 2000s through the 2010s, this division was one of the steadiest and highest performing in the NFL. And that division is the NFC South. From 2008 to 2020, the NFC South only had one season with a negative division-wide net EPA. But the peak season for this division was actually that first year, in 2008. In 2008, all 4 NFC South teams finished with 8 or more wins, with the Panthers and Falcons winning 12 and 11 games respectively. The Panthers, led by John Fox, had the best record in the division and were effective on both sides of the ball. But it wasn't Jake Delhomme that was driving the offense. It was the ground game. D'Angelo Williams ran for 1,515 yards and had a league-leading 18 touchdowns. Jonathan Stewart had 836 yards on the ground and got into the end zone 10 times. But even though the 2008 Panthers relied mostly on their running game, they still got it done through the air. Steve Smith Sr. led the league in yards per game, and even though Delhomme didn't throw that much, he did lead the NFL in yards per completion. The Panthers ended the season with the second best offense in the division by EPA, but it was the Saints that led the NFC South, and by a lot, like pretty much doubling the Panthers' offensive efficiency. The Saints scored the most points in the NFL in 2008, and it was Drew Brees leading the show. He had 5,069 passing yards and 34 touchdowns, leading the league in both. Despite this, he didn't have a single receiver surpass 1,000 receiving yards, as 11 players on the Saints had 100 or more receiving yards, which has to be some kind of record. I mentioned earlier that every team in this division finished with 8 or more wins. That 8-win team was the New Orleans Saints. Why is that? Their defense was ass. There were 8 games where this defense gave up 29 or more points. They only won 2 of those games. They were bottom 10 in terms of points allowed, yards allowed, and opponents' plays per drive. But even with their bad defense, by net EPA, they were still the strongest team in the division, solely bolstered by Drew Brees and this offense. The third best team in the division was the Buccaneers in what was John Gruden's last season in Tampa Bay. With a loaded staff with notable names like Monty Kiffin, Sean McVay, Raheem Morris, and Jay Gruden, this team was better on defense than on offense, with the best defensive EPA in this division and the 6th best defense in the NFL. The QB situation in Tampa Bay wasn't great, as Jeff Garcia played most of the games with Brian Griese filling in for 5, with both of these QBs combining for only 18 touchdowns and 13 picks. The running game wasn't great either, as no rusher had 800 yards, and they only had 13 touchdowns on the ground between 4 backs and 1 touchdown from Garcia. The 2008 Bucs defense was a sum of its parts rather than being propped up by star talent. This was Derek Brooks' last season, and Rondé Barber was at the tail end of his career. But the thing that this defense did well is turn the ball over. Barber had 4 picks, and so did rookie Aqib Talib. The team had 22 picks in total and forced 11 fumbles as they ended the year 5th in opponent takeaways. The final team in the division had the 2nd best record, but actually netted out as the worst team in the NFC South in net EPA, with that being the Atlanta Falcons. But it's even insane that this team was able to get to 11 wins with all the shit that they went through in 2007. Michael Vick pleaded guilty to dogfighting conspiracy and was sentenced to 23 months in prison. And after just 13 games in the role, head coach Bobby Petrino just up and left in the middle of the season and promptly took the head coaching job at the University of Arkansas. Petrino informed his players of his departure via 4-sentence laminated notes left at the locker of each player. But even with all that shit going on from 07, the Falcons were still able to put together a playoff year in 08. This was Matt Ryan's rookie year, and he had 3,440 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 11 picks, winning Offensive Rookie of the Year. Michael Turner went off this year as he led the league in attempts and was 1 yard short of 1,700 rushing yards, but he did have 17 rushing touchdowns on his way to a first-team All-Pro season, finishing second in MVP. Roddy White was Ryan's main pass catcher, ending the year with 1,382 yards and 7 touchdowns, with the second receiver being Michael Jenkins at 777 yards. As far as the Falcons' defense goes, John Abraham had the most sacks of his career at 30 years old with 16.5 sacks. This defense was 24th in yards allowed and 28th in opponent takeaways. They were 21st in first downs allowed and passing yards allowed as well, while being 25th in rushing yards allowed. But even with all of that, they somehow ended the year 11th in points allowed. The second strongest NFC South season since 2002 was at the start of this decade, in 2020. Which is kind of hilarious because there were two teams that had 5 and 4 wins, which are the Panthers and the Falcons. But that just goes to show you how good the Saints and the Bucs were this year. Even with this being Breeze's last season and his arm barely hanging on by a thread, the Saints still went 12-4, with Taysom Hill even getting a pretty significant number of snaps as quarterback. They scored 30.1 points per game, and in the regular season, they never had a game less than 21 points. The defense was also great, with Trey Hendrickson as the leading sack getter, Cam Jordan with a Pro Bowl season, Demario Davis with a second-team All-Pro season, and 5 players with at least 2 picks on the year. They made it to the divisional round, where they eventually lost to the Bucs. This was Tom Brady's first year in Tampa Bay, and he went off. 4,600 yards, 40 touchdowns, leading the Bucs to scoring 40-plus points 4 times in the regular season. With second-team All-Pro backers in Levante David and Devin White, along with great secondary play from Carlton Davis, Antoine Winfield Jr., and others, this defense ranked out in the top 10 to end the year. This Bucs team, of course, made it all the way to the Super Bowl and dominated the Chiefs 31-9, with Ndamukong Suh and Shaq Barrett getting pressure on Mahomes all night. Now the last division, the NFC East, has been the strongest division in the NFC since 2002, just barely beating out the NFC South. And coincidentally, the NFC East's strongest year was the same year as the South, 2008. Just like the NFC South in 08, all 4 teams in the NFC East finished with 8 or more wins. But this division had teams that finished top 5 in the league when looking at both sides of the ball. The Giants won the division with the 12-4 record, coming off of a Super Bowl winning 2007 year, where they pulled off one of the most miraculous seasons of all time. The only Pro Bowler on the Giants offense in 2008 was Eli Manning. But this Giants offense wasn't successful off the back of Eli. It was successful because of earth, wind, and fire. Brandon Jacobs, Derek Ward, and Ahmad Bradshaw set the Giants' franchise record for total rushing yards at 2,518. Each of these 3 running backs ran for over 5 or more yards per attempt. Both Jacobs and Ward had over 1,000 rushing yards. Jacobs had 15 touchdowns on the ground and led the Giants to finish the year first in rushing yards. On the receiving side, the Giants had 6 receivers who had 384 or more receiving yards. But you can't talk about the 2008 Giants offense without mentioning Plaxico Burress shooting himself in the leg in a nightclub. The Giants were 11-1 before the incident. They finished the year 1-4 after. Not saying it was his fault, but Brian Dawkins later explained how Burress being out changed the team's defensive game plan as they could now put extra defenders in the box. Their defense was still good post-Strahan retirement, ranking out just under their offense, with the first-team All-Pro season from Justin Tuck, who had 12 sacks. Corey Webster, Aaron Ross, and James Butler each had 3 picks, with Corey Webster tied for first in the league for pass deflections with 24, and grading out as PFF's 3rd best cornerback season from 2006 to 2016. But even though the Giants had a better record, it was the 9-6-1 Eagles that led the division in net EPA, powered by a defense that finished 3rd in the NFL in efficiency. Players like Brian Dawkins, who forced 6 fumbles, Quentin McKell, who made second-team All-Pro, Asante Samuel, who was the other player that led the league in pass deflections, and had 4 picks, and 11 players that had multiple sacks. They were 4th in opponent points allowed, 3rd in opponent yards per allowed, and held opponents under 2 touchdowns in half of their games. Their offense was average, with Donovan McNabb leading the charge, throwing for just under 4,000 yards, with his main receiving threat being Deshaun Jackson. Brian Westbrook had 936 yards on the ground with 9 touchdowns. The Eagles heading into Week 17 needed a win to clinch a playoff berth. And after the game was tied up 3-3 at the end of the first quarter, the Eagles exploded for 41 points in the second and third quarters to clinch the NFC's number 6 seed. The Eagles proceeded to make some noise in the playoffs. They beat the Vikings by 2 scores in the wild card, then matched up against the Giants in the divisional round, where the Eagles' defense clamped down on Eli, forcing him into 2 picks, so there would be no back-to-back in New York. And even though the Cardinals were up 24-6 going into halftime, the Eagles clawed back to eventually go up by 1 at the beginning of the fourth, but they couldn't hold on to the lead as Arizona ended up winning by a touchdown. Larry Fitzgerald was dominant in this game, with 152 yards and 3 touchdowns. But looking back to Week 17, the team that the Eagles beat was also in a win-and-in Week 17 scenario, but their loss left them right outside the postseason. And that team was the Dallas Cowboys. This was the Cowboys' last season in Texas Stadium, and the season started out well with the Cowboys going 3-0, putting up over 450 yards in 2 of those games. Then things started to go downhill. After dropping 2 out of their next 3 games, Tony Romo sat out the next 3 games with a fractured pinky. 40-year-old Brad Johnson filled in and went 1-2 with 2 touchdowns and 5 picks. So heading into their bye week, the Cowboys were 5-4. They won 3 straight games, scoring 30 points in 2 of those games, then lost to the Steelers, beat the Giants, and then lost 2 straight to end the year, including that 44-6 beatdown in Week 17. Also, in December, a report came out that T.O. thought that Romo and Witten held private meetings together and created plays without including Owens. This all happened nearly 1 year after T.O. went to bat for his QB. Now, Washington in 2008 was an interesting team. They started out the year 6-2, but all 6 of their wins were by 7 points or less. Then they proceeded to go 2-6 to finish the year and scored less than 2 touchdowns in 6 of their final 8 games. The second strongest season for the NFC East was actually the year prior in 2007. All teams won 8 or more games. The Cowboys went 13-3, winning the NFC East for the first time since 1998. They did lose to the Giants in the divisional round, and of course those Giants went on to win the Super Bowl. The Giants were actually 4th in the division in terms of net EPA, and were 14th in points scored and 17th in points allowed, which makes their playoff run even that much more impressive. So as we move on to the AFC, let's start with the division with the strongest season in the conference, but also the division that has performed the worst since 2002, not only in the AFC, but in the entire NFL, by a lot, and that's the AFC South. 2007 is a true outlier of a year for positive performance in this division. The Colts led the division with a 13-win season, followed by the 11-win Jags, 10-win Titans, and 8-win Texans. Coming off of their Super Bowl win in the prior year, the Colts were 2nd in offense in the NFL, only trailing a certain undefeated team, and the Jags were actually 3rd in offense as well. Peyton Manning had an efficient year, going for 4,040 yards and 31 touchdowns, but he did have a game where he threw 6 picks against the Chargers, an opponent that we'll bring up later on. Joseph Adai had 1,072 yards and 12 touchdowns, and with Marvin Harrison out for most of the year with a knee injury, Reggie Wayne stepped up with a 1,510-yard season with 10 touchdowns. This 2007 Colts team ranked 1st in points against, only allowing 16.4 points per game. They did this with Robert Mathis leading the team in sacks with 7, with the second highest being a tie at 3.5 between Bob Sanders and Dwight Freeney. But what this team did incredibly well is force turnovers. First team All-Pro and Defensive Player of the Year Bob Sanders had 2 picks. Gary Brackett and Antoine Bethea both had 4, while both Robert Mathis and Dwight Freeney had 4 forced fumbles. This team lost their first playoff game to the Chargers 28-24, even with Manning throwing for 400 yards, and both Phillip Rivers and LaDainian Tomlinson leaving the game early due to an injury. Like I mentioned earlier, the Colts ranked 2nd in offense in 2007, and the Jaguars were 3rd. This offense took a bit of time to get going, but starting in Week 8, the Jags put up 24 or more points for the remainder of their games in the regular season. Even with the backup QB Quinn Gray playing in 4 games, the Jags were able to put up top of the league numbers in pretty much every category. But where this team shined was on the ground. Fred Taylor and Maurice Jones-Drew gave the Jags the 2nd most rushing yards in the NFL in 2007 with 14 combined touchdowns. No receiver passed 630 yards, which is tough, but Reggie Williams did catch 10 touchdowns. They were slightly above average on defense. They didn't have a single Pro Bowler on that side of the ball, but their safety duo gave them a lot of ball production with 9 combined picks, while Paul Spicer had 7.5 sacks and 3 forced fumbles. The Jags beat the Steelers in the wild card, which marked the first time a team had beat the Steelers at home twice in the same season, something they actually did again in 2017. They eventually ran into the Patriots in the divisional round, and it was tied 14-14 at halftime, but the Pats eventually pulled away. The second best defense in the division belonged to the Titans, led by a familiar face. Kyle Vanden Bosch and Antoine Odom led the team in sacks, but it was Albert Hainsworth that was the engine of this defense, as he had 6 sacks, 12 TFLs, and 15 QB hits on his way to a first-team All-Pro season and ended the year second in DPOY voting. Linebacker Keith Bullock had 5 picks, and Nick Harper and Michael Griffin both had 3. Now the offense, on the other hand. It was the worst in the division and towards the bottom of the NFL. Vince Young had 9 touchdowns this season, and he also had 17 picks. But Lendale White had a good season with 1,110 yards on the ground with 7 touchdowns. Given their points scored and points allowed, they had a projected 8-8 win total. But this team still made it to the playoffs where they lost in the wild card to the Chargers 17-6. But a team that did go 8-8 was the 2007 Texans. To be honest, there's really nothing notable about this team. The QB room was composed of Matt Schaub and Sage Rosenfels, who threw for 3,751 yards with 24 touchdowns and 21 picks. The leading rusher was Ron Dane with 773 yards. And Andre Johnson had an incredible start to the season with back-to-back games of 142 yards and 120 yards, but he missed the next 7 games with an injury. This division's second best season was the following year in 2008, where the Titans won 13 games this time, the Colts won 12, the Texans won 8 again, and the Jags only won 5. But like I mentioned before, this division has performed the worst in football since 2002. From 2010 to 2025, the AFC South has only had 2 seasons with a positive net EPA, and both times they barely crossed that mark. What they had no trouble with is putting up some of the worst seasons across any division, like in 2013, which was this division's worst performing season with the Jags and Texans as the worst teams in the league, and the Titans and Colts just barely above average. And that's the sad part, because the other 3 AFC divisions are all at the top in terms of performance since 2002. So we'll go through them from 3rd strongest overall to the best division in football over that time. First is the AFC East. 2004 was the AFC East peak season. The Pats went 14-2, the Jets went 10-6, the Bills went 9-7, and the Dolphins were 4-12. The Patriots were the best team in football this year, coming off of 2 Super Bowl victories in the last 3 seasons. Although they didn't have the best defense or offense, they were just great on both sides of the ball. Brady threw for just under 3,700 yards with 28 touchdowns, and Corey Dillon had a monster year with 1,635 yards and 12 touchdowns in his first year with the Pats. The defense played great as they held opponents under 2 touchdowns in 7 regular season games. You had first-team All-Pro defensive end Richard Seymour, Willie McGinnis with 9.5 sacks, Rodney Harrison and Teddy Bruschi as the leading tacklers on the team and both second-team All-Pros. Also Mike Vrabel, who had the second most sacks on the team with 5.5. This team was the number 1 seed in the AFC, dominated the Colts in the divisional, beat the Steelers in the conference championship by 14, then forced 4 turnovers in the Super Bowl on the way to a 24-21 win. The Jets were second in the division and had the 10th ranked defense in the NFL in 2004, starting out the season 5-0. They only had 1 Pro Bowler on defense, which was John Abraham, who had 9.5 sacks. Also the 3rd time we've mentioned John Abraham in this video. But Jonathan Vilma did win Defensive Rookie of the Year. The offense was driven by Curtis Martin, who is 3 yards short of a 1,700-yard season and had 12 touchdowns with 245 receiving yards. Santana Moss was the leading pass catcher with Chad Pennington under center. This team beat the Chargers in the wild card in overtime, but lost to the Steelers in the divisional, also in overtime. But it was actually the 9-7 Bills, who had the best defense in the division and the best defense in the league by EPA. They had 4 Pro Bowlers, including Sam Adams, Nate Clements, Takeo Spikes, and Terrence McGee. And the reason for this league-leading defensive EPA were the turnovers. They had 24 picks, with Clements and Spikes combining for 11 of those, and forced 21 fumbles. They were second in yards allowed and were great defending the run and pass. And although the offense was 25th in yards gained, they were 7th in points scored. Drew Bledsoe wasn't great with just 20 touchdowns to 16 picks, but Willis McGahee ran for 1,128 yards, and Travis Henry had 326. The Bills also had 5 return touchdowns, 2 punts, and 3 kickoffs. They missed out on the playoffs, but their expected record given points allowed and points scored was 11-5, which would have been second in the division. And then there were the Dolphins. The previous year they went 10-6, But the sudden retirement of Ricky Williams at the age of 27, where after he retired he said, "I'm finally free. I can't remember ever being this happy," and 2 games postponed due to 2 separate hurricanes were just too much to overcome as they went 4-12. But even with this poor record, they did have an upset win against the Patriots, who were 12-1 at that point, in a game that I guess was called the night that courage wore orange. This division's second best season was somewhat recent, in 2022. This was propped up by the Bills being one of the best teams in the NFL, while the other 3 teams who had 7, 8, and 9 wins were all just decent. But coincidentally, the 2005 season was the AFC East's lowest performing season, as both the Jets and the Bills were absolute dog shit, while the Patriots weren't their usual high performing selves. But 2005 wasn't bad for everyone, because in 2005 is when the AFC West had its strongest year. Now, if I were to use average win percentage and point differential, it would have chosen 2013 as the strongest season. But where I think that metric fails is that it doesn't take into account how good a team the 2005 Chargers were despite their record. Despite having the 6th best net EPA in the entire NFL, the 2005 Chargers went 9-7 and were 3rd in their division. Their first 5 losses to start the year were all by 4 points or less. This was Drew Brees' last season in San Diego, and he was still the starter as he beat out second-year QB Phillip Rivers for the starting QB spot. And this Chargers team had some really good pieces. LaDainian Tomlinson and Antonio Gates were both all pros, as Tomlinson had 1,800 yards from scrimmage and Gates had 1,101. Keenan McCardell at age 35 had 917 yards and 9 touchdowns as well. On defense, Sean Merriman made an instant impact his rookie year with 10 sacks and 2 forced fumbles. After a standout Week 15 win against the Colts, who were still undefeated at this point, the Chargers lost their final 2 games where they only scored 7 in each game. Brees tore his labrum in the final game of the season, which eventually led him signing with the Saints and spending the rest of his career there. But again, the Chargers were 9-7 and 3rd in the division. The team that was first in the AFC West in 2005 was the Denver Broncos. With Mike Shanahan coming off back-to-back 10-win seasons, the Broncos went up another level, finishing the year 4th in offense and 8th in defense. Jake the Snake Plummer had 3,336 yards with 18 touchdowns, with his main target being Rod Smith, who cleared 1,100 yards. But it was their running game that excelled. Mike Anderson had over 1,000 yards, while Tatum Bell had 921, as they combined for 20 rushing touchdowns. Champ Bailey was a first-team All-Pro this year with 8 interceptions and 2 pick-sixes. But it wasn't just Bailey that was taking the ball away. This Broncos defense ended the year 4th in takeaways, with Nick Ferguson intercepting the ball 5 times, while John Lynch and Ian Gold forced 4 fumbles each. This defense wasn't great at stopping the pass, but they were great at stopping the run. They allowed the second fewest yards on the ground and had 5 games where they held their opponents under 100 rushing yards. This team made it to the conference championship game, where they lost to the Steelers. And Broncos fans point out some of the blame due to the fact that they couldn't rush the passer. So Big Ben sat comfortably in the pocket and was 21 for 29 with 275 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Chiefs were the number 2 seed in this division, coached by Dick Vermeil, where 2005 would be his final year coaching in the NFL. Their offense was strong this year, good enough for 2nd in the division and 5th in the NFL. Trent Green threw for over 4,000 yards with 17 touchdowns, and Eddie Kennison clearing 1,100 yards, and Tony Gonzalez reaching 905. But after Priest Holmes suffered a spinal injury by Sean Merriman during Week 7, Larry Johnson took over and took off. From weeks 1 through 7, Larry Johnson cleared 100 rushing yards 1 time, and that was in their first game against the Jets, who had a bottom 10 defense. Then from Week 8 to Week 17, Larry Johnson had 100 yards in every single game, including 2 games with 200 plus yards, and had 16 rushing touchdowns as well. He ran for 99 first downs and ended the year on the All-Pro second team. On the defensive side, second-year Jared Allen had 11 sacks, while Greg Wesley had 6 picks and Patrick Surtain had 4. This team missed out on the playoffs even with their 10-6 record, becoming the 6th 10-win team to fail to qualify for the playoffs since the wildcard was introduced. Now, the 2005 Raiders were just one of the worst teams in the NFL that year, finishing the year 4-12. There was excitement heading into this season as Raiders traded for Randy Moss from the Vikings to be their new wide receiver 1, in exchange for Napoleon Harris, the 7th overall pick in the 2005 draft, and a 7th rounder. And things didn't really work out the way that they were supposed to. The Raiders started out the year 0-3, and while they did crawl to a 3-4 record, putting up 34 plus points in 2 of those games, they then proceeded to lose their next 8 out of 9 games to end the year 4-12. Moss had just over 1,000 receiving yards, but after 3 games with 120 plus yards through the first 4 weeks of the season, Moss only had triple-digit receiving yards 1 more time this season, which was in Week 17. But the defense was even worse. Even with a 16-sack season from Derek Burgess, the Raiders just couldn't stop anything. They were 27th in yards allowed, 25th in points allowed, and were 29th in the league in opponent takeaways. The Raiders gave up 22 or more points in 12 games this season, and the only game they kept a team under 10 points, well, they lost to the Browns. The only other AFC West seasons that come close to this peak were 2002 and 2013. 2002 was bolstered heavily by the AFC champ Raiders, who notoriously lost in the Super Bowl to John Gruden's Bucks, while the rest of the division either won 9 or 8 games. And 2013 was a year of incredible offenses in this division. The 2013 Broncos offense was unreal, as Peyton Manning was slinging the rock all season with 5,477 passing yards and 55 touchdowns. This team had a 1,400-yard receiver in Demaryius Thomas, a nearly 1,300-yard receiver in Eric Decker, and 2 nearly 800-yard pass catchers in Julius Thomas and Wes Welker. But it was the 2013 Chargers that were second in the NFL in offensive EPA. Phillip Rivers led the league in completion percentage while throwing for 4,478 yards and 32 touchdowns. Ryan Matthews had 1,255 yards, while rookie Keenan Allen was the leading pass catcher with 1,046 yards and 8 touchdowns. Now, the next and final division hasn't been known for elite offenses, and actually looking at offensive performance alone, the division ranks third to last in the NFL since 2002. Yet the AFC North has been the best performing division in football since the realignment, and this division's peak came in the year 2011. Now, the lead into this season was a 130-day lockout that started in March and ended in July. And even though the 2011 season is famously remembered for having 3 5,000-plus yard passers, in 2011, the AFC North was all about defense. All 4 of these teams were top 10 in points against, with the Steelers as the number 1 team, allowing only 14.2 points per game, while the Ravens were third, allowing 16.6, and even the 4-12 Browns were in 5th place in that category. The Steelers and Ravens tied with a 12-4 record, but since the Ravens went undefeated in division games, we'll cover them first. I mentioned their defense, so let's just go through some of the players on that side of the ball. Ray Lewis, Haloti Ngata, Terrell Suggs, Ed Reed, and even players like Ladarius Webb, who had 5 picks and a pick 6. On the other side of the ball, Joe Flacco had a decent season with 3,600 yards and 20 touchdowns, while Anquan Boldin and Torrey Smith had 800 yards apiece. The Ravens had a first-round bye, but they eventually fell to the Patriots in the AFC Championship game by 3 points, where Billy Cundiff had the chance to tie the game with a 32-yard field goal, but it was way off. The Steelers were coming off of a Super Bowl loss in 2010, where they led the league in points against and were first in defensive EPA. And I mentioned that the Steelers' defense in 2011 was first in points against, but they were actually 7th in the league in defensive EPA. The main reason for that? They generated the least amount of turnovers in the NFL and were 31st in percentage of opponent drives that ended in a score. But don't let that fool you, because this team obviously still got it done on defense. Troy Polamalu was a first-team All-Pro this year. James Harrison and LaMarr Woodley both had 9 sacks, and even Ryan Clark was a Pro Bowler this year. This team produced 2 shutouts and had 4 more games holding teams under 10 points. The offense was powered by a passing attack with both Mike Wallace and Antonio Brown clearing 1,100 yards, with Big Ben throwing for 4,077 yards and 21 touchdowns. Although by net EPA this team was 7th in the NFL this season, and they faced off against a Denver team in the wild card that was 28th in net EPA, they were unable to get the win. But honestly, you can't blame them, because the other team had Jesus on their side. Now, the Bengals were slightly above average in terms of net EPA in 2011, and again, with the theme, it was mainly off the back of their defense. Geno Atkins led the pack with 7.5 sacks, one of the most underrated players of the 2010s. Reggie Nelson had 4 interceptions with a pick 6, while Carlos Dunlap tied the team in QB hits. This offense was driven by 2 rookies, QB Andy Dalton and wide receiver AJ Green. Carson Palmer requested a trade and threatened to retire in the offseason, but with Dalton leading the Bengals to start the year 6-2, since he shipped off Palmer to the Raiders for a first-round pick and a conditional second-rounder. This team made it to the playoffs, where they eventually got stomped in the wild card by the Texans, where JJ Watt went nuts. Now, the 4-12 Browns were fascinating. Again, they had the 5th ranked defense in terms of points against, but they were 19th in the NFL in terms of defensive EPA. They didn't generate many turnovers, but they were 2nd in passing yards allowed, while being 30th in rushing yards allowed. So they led up long drives, with their defense giving up the most plays per drive and the 2nd longest average time per drive. They didn't have a single Pro Bowler on the defensive side of the ball, although middle linebacker DeQuell Jackson did lead the league in solo tackles. Colt McCoy was trying his best, but with 2,700 passing yards and their leading rusher in Peyton Hillis only gaining 587 yards on the ground, the Browns were the 6th worst offense in the NFL. Now, like I mentioned at the top of the video, originally I was going to use average win percentage and point differential to determine each division's strongest year. But when that result gave me 2023 as the AFC North's peak season, I knew I had to go in a different direction. Now, that methodology wasn't completely faulty, as 2023 was the 2nd strongest season when using net EPA. But in good conscience, I couldn't let the 11-6 Browns, who started 5 separate QBs, where the team's expected win-loss based on points scored and points allowed gave them a 9-8 record, be the driving factor of 2023 being the peak season. Now, what this season did legitimately have is one of the strongest teams in football, full stop. The 2023 Ravens were incredible. MVP Lamar, 4 All-Pros on defense, and even someone like Geno Stone getting 7 picks. Unfortunately, they ran into Mahomes in the AFC Championship game, but this team is truly one of the better teams in NFL history to not make a Super Bowl. It's going to be interesting to see how division performance plays out over the next 5 to 10 years, and see how these divisions stack up against each other then. Let's see if the AFC South can pull itself out of the gutter, if the AFC North will start to falter, or if any of the NFC divisions can make their way to the top of the NFL.